this presentation in our series, A Roadmap for Healthcare Publishing, we're going to talk about ethics. We're going to talk about understanding the ethical issues that authors face and that journals face as part of the submission and publication process for medical science healthcare articles. Permissions, plagiarism, and people. Permissions in terms of getting the right ethical permissions, the right institutional review board permissions for your study. Plagiarism, so that means not using the work of others without citing it appropriately. And authorship. People. Who should be an author on your study and where should they go in the order of authors? Before we get started, let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. Do you know the main reasons that healthcare articles get rejected from international journals? What's the main reason or reasons why editors turn down submissions in the medical science and healthcare field? Secondly, ask yourself, do you know what's the main issue that editorial offices face when dealing with healthcare articles submitted to international journals? Answering these two key questions will help you, as an author, avoid these kinds of issues in your own work, because in fact, it's the questions that we will address in this presentation. How can we avoid rejection? How can we make sure that our research meets all of the necessary ethical guidelines for publication in leading international journals? Journals check submitted articles before passing them out for peer review. Editorial triage takes place at international journals. They check permissions and they check for plagiarism. Editorial office staff will go through your article against the guidelines, against the aims and scope of the particular journal, and they will check that everything is in there. All of the checklists have been correctly completed and there are no ethical issues. At the same time, journals often have to deal with authorship related issues after submission, coming back from the authorship team. So it's important, in order to maintain ethical compliance with your work, to think about who did what. Organize and agree your authorship with your team before starting the work process, because changes are very hard to make once an article has been submitted, because all co-authors and the editor and the journal and the publishing company will need to agree any further changes. So let's look at reasons why healthcare articles tend to get rejected, starting with the issue of permissions. If you're using human subjects in your research, you must have institutional review board ethical approval before you start the study. You often are going to need written informed consent from your subjects before you include data relating to them in your study. And journals want to check this. So you will need to make sure that you have prospectively registered your trial, your intervention. You've got that ethical approval. You've registered the fact that you do have that ethical approval in one of the World Health Organization recognized databases. This is important to think about before starting your study, let alone before starting to write up your study. This is one of the key reasons why research gets rejected from international medical and healthcare journals. So think about going through some of the checklists to make sure that you don't fall foul of some of these guidelines. Look at what you are investigating, the variable, the condition, the intervention, what you're measuring, that measured outcome, and where your measurements come from? The sample, the population. Going through these thought processes before starting with the experiment, the intervention, the trial, or before starting to write will make sure that you increase your chances of making it through editorial triage and getting your work sent out for peer review. One of the well-known checklists that authors use, that journals ask authors to use, is the PICO checklist. The patient population. Who does your work relate to? Where's the intervention? Which treatment are you using? And what's the control? What comparisons are you making in the study? And finally, what's the outcome? What are you measuring? Going through these checklists before doing the research, before writing up the research will help you to ensure that your work meets all of the necessary guidelines for eventual peer review and eventual publication. Secondly, then, the other main reason why academic articles get rejected by international journals is because of plagiarism, the use of citations without appropriate attribution in your work. If you read something or if you wish to use something from another study, you must cite it in your article. There are three main kinds of plagiarism that journals encounter: mosaic, paraphrasing, and self-plagiarism. In the first case, mosaic plagiarism, authors include data from various sources, mix them together to make that piece of writing seem original. In paraphrasing plagiarism, authors rewrite from an original piece of text, but the idea remains the same. In self-plagiarism, often an area that authors are unaware of, you have to cite yourself if you use information, text, figures, tables, photographs from one of your previous publications. It's best practice to cite your previous work thoroughly, even if you're simply revisiting an old idea or a previously published observation. Journals check. And here's what a plagiarism check looks like. Journals run your document through a piece of software that compares it to one of a number of online databases for published works: Scopus, Web of Science, Crossref, PubMed, and they come back with scores, as you can see here. Have you appropriately attributed all of the information in your article to its original source? Here you can see that what you're aiming for is a plagiarism score of 10% or less. That's the industry standard, and if you score 10% or less, the journal will consider sending your work on for peer review. If you score higher, you've got a problem, and the journal will probably reject the paper outright. So bulletproof your work. Inadvertent plagiarism can happen if you read something in a second language and then without thinking use it in your own writing. You will score highly on one of these plagiarism checking pieces of software. So consider getting your documents evaluated by a plagiarism checking service before submission. Keep careful records of your reference sources. Use EndNote, Mendeley, one of the many reference management tools that are out there and available, because journals, publishers, they check authors' addresses, they send papers for plagiarism checks before peer review. And as we've discussed, journals are looking for less than 10% similarity with already published sources, or they're going to consider that you've recycled, you've plagiarized information from another publication. Software searches already published literature across standard databases, Crossref, Scopus, and so on. They've negotiated access to different databases, so you may wish indeed to use more than one service, but going for less than 10% and always citing the work of others appropriately in your articles. Thirdly then, and the number one issue actually that editorial offices face later in the process, after peer review, often after publication even, as an ethical consideration is authorship, the number one issue that editors face. How many authors should a paper have? The right number to comply with ethical guidelines. International journals follow conventions laid down by COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE. Authorship on a paper should be based on 1. Substantial contributions to conception and design, including acquisition of data, analysis, and interpretation. 2. Drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content. And 3. Providing final approval of the version to be published. You have to meet, an author on your article has to meet all 3 of these criteria to be considered an author, and journals will ask you for signed declarations from all of your co-authors stating who did what. Any changes after submission are very hard to make. So talk to your colleagues, talk to your team, talk to your co-authors, and agree authorship before starting to write. Have a look at this example published on the 22nd of October in Science, Autoantibodies and COVID-19. More than 200 co-authors. All of these authors will have stated in a declaration to Science, the journal Science, what they did and why they deserve, and it's justified that they are co-authors on this study. Keep in mind how much it would be a problem to make changes later in the process. Authorship as an issue at international journals is really the number one issue that editors often face. We have talked in this presentation about understanding ethics as part of our roadmap for healthcare publishing training series. Permissions, plagiarism, and people, the issue of authorship. Thank you for listening.